In March 2013, Cyprus seized 47.5% of every bank deposit over €100,000. Overnight. No vote, no warning. The world's wealthiest people watched this unfold and didn't flinch, because their money was never sitting in those banks to begin with. You've been told the safe havens during a crisis are gold, treasuries and the US dollar. That's the script handed to ordinary savers. But the actual playbook of dynastic wealth, the one written inside family office memos and Freeport vault inventories, looks nothing like that. It's older, stranger, and in some cases, technically engineered to sit outside the reach of any government, court or banking institution on Earth. 7 assets, each one a fortress. The 7th carries a legal exception so obscure most financial advisors have never heard of it, and it's the reason a single Roosevelt-era loophole still protects billions in private wealth today. There's a term family offices use that almost never appears in retail finance content: counterparty extinction risk. It's the recognition that during a true systemic crisis, the institution holding your money matters more than the money itself. A brokerage account is a promise. A bank balance is an IOU. A treasury bond is an entry on a ledger maintained by the same government deciding whether to inflate its way out of debt. Billionaires don't fear market crashes. They fear the moment the ledger itself becomes negotiable. 2008 wasn't terrifying because stocks fell. It was terrifying because money market funds broke the buck, and Lehman's $639 billion balance sheet evaporated in 72 hours. The Reserve Primary Fund, which held Lehman commercial paper, dropped to 97 cents on the dollar and triggered a $300 billion run within days. Every asset on this list shares one trait. It cannot be conjured into existence by central bank software, and it cannot be seized through a digital keystroke. That's the entire game. Asset 1. Farmland. The dirt under your feet is the oldest store of value in human history. The modern billionaire class has quietly become the largest private buyer of it on the planet. Bill Gates owns approximately 275,000 acres across 18 US states, making him the largest private farmland owner in America. The land is held through Cascade Investment, his family office, structured across at least 22 separate LLCs to obscure the trail. This isn't a hobby, it's a thesis. Farmland has produced an average annual return of roughly 11% since 1990, with negative correlation to equities during recessions. During the 2008 crash, when the S&P 500 lost 38%, US farmland values rose 15.9%. During the 1970s stagflation, the exact macro scenario keeping today's wealth managers awake, farmland was one of 3 asset classes that beat inflation by double digits. Here's what doesn't show up in the brochures. Farmland generates 2 income streams the IRS treats with extraordinary leniency: cash rent from operators and a depreciation schedule on improvements like irrigation, drainage, and structures that can shelter most of that income from tax. Layer in a 1031 exchange when you sell, and the asset compounds essentially tax-deferred across generations. The Mormon Church, through its corporate arm, owns roughly 2 million acres in the United States. The wonderful company, Stuart and Linda Resnick, controls more California water and pistachio acreage than any other private entity. The Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund has been buying alfalfa farms in drought-stricken Arizona to ship the crop home, exporting US groundwater in commodity form. When you understand what they're really buying, it isn't dirt. It's a perpetual royalty on human caloric demand, a contract written in a language no government can rewrite. Asset 2. Freeport stored art and collectibles. There is a building in Geneva, 4 stories tall and brutally unremarkable from the street, that contains an estimated 1.2 million artworks. The collection inside is worth somewhere between $100 billion and $200 billion. No museum on Earth comes close. The Louvre holds about 615,000 objects. The Met holds 1.5 million, but most are study fragments. Geneva Freeport stores more high-grade fine art than any cultural institution in human history, and almost none of it has ever been seen by the public. Welcome to the most profitable secret in offshore wealth. A Freeport is technically a customs zone. Goods stored inside are considered in transit, never legally imported into Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg, or wherever the Freeport sits. That single classification triggers a cascade of advantages no other asset class enjoys. First, no VAT, no import duty, no capital gains event when you sell. 2 billionaires can transfer a $40 million Rothko between their respective storage units inside the same building, and the transaction generates 0 taxable footprint in either home country. The painting never legally crossed a border. Second, ownership through bearer-style shell structures. The Freeport doesn't ask whose painting it is. The locker is leased to a Panamanian holding company owned by a Liechtenstein foundation, administered by a Cayman trustee. Tracing the actual beneficial owner can take international investigators years. Third, and this is what makes it crisis-proof, physical custody outside the banking system. When Cyprus froze deposits in 2013, when Greece imposed capital controls in 2015, when Russian assets were frozen across Western banks in 2022, art in Freeport storage was untouched. It's not a financial instrument. It's an object behind a steel door in a neutral jurisdiction. The 2016 Yves Bouvier scandal cracked the door open just enough for the public to glimpse what was inside. Bouvier, the Freeport's largest tenant, was accused of overcharging Russian oligarch Dmitry Rybolovlev by roughly $1 billion across 38 paintings, including the Da Vinci that later sold for $450 million as Salvator Mundi. The case revealed that single Freeport units contained Picassos, Modiglianis and Warhols, rotating between hidden owners faster than they appeared in public auction records. Christie's and Sotheby's now report that roughly 40% of high-end auction lots either originate from or are headed to a Freeport. The art market has effectively become a shadow currency system. Works move, value transfers, no fiat changes hands. The entry barrier is brutal. Quality starts around $500,000 per work and rises into 8 figures fast. Storage runs roughly $1,000 per square meter annually. Insurance is its own ecosystem, but for the buyer who clears that bar, the asset behaves like nothing else. Portable enough to fit in a briefcase, durable enough to outlive empires, and legally invisible enough to survive every bank failure of the last 100 years. Which raises the question billionaires actually care about. What happens when the next crisis isn't financial, but jurisdictional? Asset 3. Water rights. In 2020, water began trading on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange under the ticker NQH20. Wall Street called it the moment water became the new oil. That framing missed the point by about 4 decades. The smart money was already there. T. Boone Pickens, the late Texas oilman, spent the final stretch of his career assembling water rights instead of drilling them. By 2011, he controlled rights to roughly 200,000 acre-feet of Ogallala aquifer water, sitting under the Texas Panhandle. He'd recognized something the energy markets were slow to. The world has a roughly 50-year supply of accessible petroleum and a finite, depleting supply of fresh water that supports 8 billion people. Water rights in the American West operate under a doctrine called prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. A senior water right granted in 1880 to a ranching family still legally outranks every claim made afterward, including the entire population of Las Vegas. This creates a tradable asset older than most American corporations, with a legal pedigree no court has overturned in 145 years. Michael Burry, the Big Short investor, quietly shifted into water exposure after 2010, buying agricultural land specifically for its embedded water rights, rather than its growing potential. His thesis was simple. Water is the only commodity you cannot substitute, cannot synthesize at scale, and cannot import economically across continents. The ownership structures are deliberately opaque. Water rights in Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, and California are typically held inside private LLCs attached to ranchland, agricultural co-ops, or municipal supply contracts. They don't appear on public exchanges in their pure form. Acquisition usually requires buying the surface land first, then severing or leasing the underlying rights, a process most retail investors don't even know is legal. A senior water right in California's Central Valley currently trades for roughly $5,000 to $15,000 per acre-foot, depending on seniority and location. During the 2014 to 2016 drought, transferable rights in some districts spiked above $2,000 per acre-foot for a single year's allocation. Here is the inversion at the core of this asset class. Most investments depend on growth. Water rights depend on scarcity. The worse the macro environment becomes, drought, population pressure, climate volatility, infrastructure decay, the more valuable the senior claim. It's the only asset on this list whose intrinsic value rises in direct proportion to civilizational stress. Asset 4. Timberland. When Yale's endowment posted some of the highest risk-adjusted returns of any institutional portfolio between 1985 and 2020, observers credited David Swenson's models, his alternative asset allocations, his discipline. What got less attention was a single asset class that quietly outperformed the S&P 500 over that entire stretch with roughly half the volatility. Standing timber. Timberland has produced an average annual return near 12.5% since 1990, according to NCR-EIF's Timberland Index. The real reason endowments and family offices pile into it is the asset's bizarre, nearly magical biological property. It grows whether the economy does or doesn't. A loblolly pine in the American South adds roughly 6% to its merchantable volume each year, regardless of what the Federal Reserve does. During the 2008 crisis, when housing demand for lumber collapsed, timber owners simply stopped harvesting and let the trees keep growing. The inventory appreciated in place. When prices recovered, they harvested into the strength. Try doing that with a steel mill or a semiconductor fab. Weyerhaeuser, structured as a REIT, controls roughly 10.5 million acres of US timberland, an area larger than the country of Belgium. The Harvard Endowment held nearly $4 billion in timber at its peak. Singapore's GIC Sovereign Fund and the Norwegian Pension Fund both maintain substantial timberland exposure. These are not retail allocations. They are deliberate hedges against the failure of every other asset on a balance sheet. The tax structure makes the picture sharper. Timber sales held over 12 months qualify for long-term capital gains treatment in the US, not ordinary income, even when the timber is the entire business. Reforestation costs are partially deductible. Conservation easements layered on top can generate 7-figure deductions, while the underlying land continues producing. A timberland tract is a closed system that requires no human labour to appreciate. It survives bank runs, currency devaluations, internet outages, supply chain freezes, and presidential transitions. The trees do not care. They photosynthesize through every recession in recorded history. 3 of the 7 are now on the table. You may have noticed the pattern. Every asset so far requires either physical custody, geographic specificity, or legal infrastructure that takes years to build. That isn't a coincidence. It's the entire point. The remaining 3 are stranger. One generates passive income in perpetuity from holes in the ground that other people dug. One has an annual return curve so consistent that Scottish distilleries use it as collateral for institutional loans. And the 7th, the one mentioned at the start, exists because of a single sentence in a 1933 executive order that nobody bothered to repeal. The wealthiest families on Earth treat the next 3 assets as the actual core of crisis-proof wealth, and the first 4 as warm-up. Asset 5. Mineral and royalty interests. There is a category of wealth in America that produces income without effort, requires no employees, owes no operational liability, and continues paying for generations after the original owner dies. It doesn't appear in retail brokerage accounts. It's almost never discussed in financial media. It sits underneath roughly 40% of all US land. Mineral rights, and the royalty streams they generate, are the most tradable invisible asset class billionaires hold. When a property in Texas, Oklahoma, North Dakota, or Pennsylvania sits over a producing oil or gas formation, the mineral rights can be severed from the surface ownership and sold separately. The holder receives a royalty, typically 12.5% to 25% of the wellhead production value, for as long as the well produces. No drilling cost, no operational risk, no dry hole exposure. The operating company carries 100% of the downside. The Bass family of Fort Worth built a generational fortune partly on Permian Basin mineral interests, with combined holdings estimated above $10 billion. The Hunt family, even after Bunker Hunt's silver collapse in 1980, retained mineral acreage that continued generating 8-figure annual royalties through every commodity cycle since. The royalty trust structure, entities like Sabine Royalty Trust or Cross Timbers, distributes nearly 100% of net cash flow with minimal corporate overhead. What makes mineral rights crisis-proof isn't just the income, it's the legal status. In most US states, mineral rights are classified as real property, meaning they survive bank failures, brokerage collapses, and most forms of creditor action that would liquidate financial assets. They can be held in trust structures that pass through generations with stepped-up bases at death, erasing decades of capital gains tax in a single estate event. The 2014 to 2016 oil collapse provided the most recent stress test. Spot crude fell from $107 to $26. Drillers went bankrupt by the dozen. Royalty holders saw income drop sharply, but never to zero, because legacy wells continued producing at lower prices, and the underlying acreage retained option value for the next price cycle. By 2022, those same royalty interests were producing record cash flows as oil rebounded above $120. Acquisition happens through specialized brokers, mineral aggregators, and family-to-family private deals that almost never advertise publicly. The asset class trades quietly, by design. among people who already know it exists. Asset 6. Bonded whiskey casks. The Macallan Distillery sold a single 60-year-old cask of 1926 single malt for $1.9 million in 2023. Not a bottle, a cask. The 40 bottles eventually drawn from it sold individually for sums approaching $300,000 each. The compound annual growth rate on that cask, from distillation to sale, exceeded 13.5%, beating the S&P 500 over the same 97-year stretch. Cask whiskey is the asset class billionaires use to monetize one of the few processes humans cannot accelerate: time. A cask is purchased while the spirit is still maturing inside a bonded warehouse, typically in Scotland, with a registered HMRC bond that places the cask outside immediate UK tax jurisdiction until withdrawal. The owner holds title to a specific cask, identified by warehouse number and Angels Share documentation. Every year the spirit ages, the volume drops slightly through evaporation, but the per-litre value rises exponentially because aged stock is finite, and demand from Asia, the Middle East and the US continues climbing. The Livex Whiskey 100 Index has produced an average annual return near 9.6% over the past decade, with low correlation to equity markets. Knight Frank's Luxury Investment Index regularly ranks rare whiskey as one of the top 3 performing collectible categories on a 10-year basis, ahead of art, classic cars and watches in several reporting years. The crisis-proof element is the bond itself. While the cask sits in a Scottish bonded warehouse, no UK duty, VAT, or capital gains event is triggered. The asset can be sold to a buyer in Singapore, Tokyo, or Dubai, with the cask never physically moving. The transaction occurs in the bond, the title transfers, and the new owner inherits the same tax-deferred position. It functions almost identically to a Freeport for liquid assets, a parallel system financial institutions have no claim against. The risks are real and under-discussed. Counterfeit cask schemes have proliferated since 2018. Non-distillery storage operators occasionally fail. Illiquidity is severe. A cask can take 6 to 18 months to sell at fair value. But for the family office allocating 1% to 3% of net worth into a defensive collectible, the asset offers something nothing else on this list does. It appreciates through doing absolutely nothing in a warehouse for decades, with the only required maintenance being the rotation of bond paperwork. Asset 7. Pre-1933 numismatic gold. On April 5, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. The order made it a federal crime for any US citizen to hold more than $100 in gold coin or bullion, with penalties including a $10,000 fine, equivalent to roughly $240,000 today, and up to 10 years in prison. Citizens were ordered to deliver their gold to the Federal Reserve by May 1st, in exchange for $20.67 per ounce. Once the confiscation was complete, Roosevelt revalued gold to $35 per ounce, instantly transferring an estimated 70% of every surrendered coin's value to the US Treasury. It was the largest peacetime asset seizure in American history, but buried in the order was a sentence that family lawyers and rare coin dealers have been quietly exploiting for 9 decades. The exemption read, in part, that the order did not apply to gold coins having a recognized special value to collectors of rare and unusual coins. That single phrase created a permanent legal carve-out. Pre-1933 US gold coinage, St. Gordon's double eagles, Liberty heads, Indian head eagles, held in graded numismatic condition, was reclassified overnight from confiscable bullion into protected collectibles. The exemption was never repealed. The case law since has held it. This is the reason multi-generational American wealth quietly accumulates pre-1933 graded gold coins instead of modern bullion. A 1924 St. Gordon's double eagle in MS65 grade contains 0.9675 ounces of gold and currently trades around $3,800, roughly $1,300 above pure spot value. That premium is not a markup. It's an insurance policy against the precedent of 1933 ever being repeated. Modern gold bullion can theoretically be confiscated again under emergency executive authority. Pre-1933 numismatic coins, by 92 years of legal classification, cannot. Court precedent treats them as art, not as monetary instruments. The IRS taxes their gains as collectibles. The state law passes them as personal property. Banks have no jurisdiction over them. They sit in private safes, family vaults, and Swiss numismatic depositories, outside every system that touches modern fiat wealth. The The investment-grade market is small and dominated by graded coins from PCGS and NGC. A serious position starts around $50,000 for a curated set and scales into 7 figures for museum-quality holdings. Liquidity is excellent through major numismatic auction houses like Heritage and Stack's Bowers, with typical bid-ask spreads around 4% to 8%, tight for an asset class this rare. The forbidden knowledge here isn't that gold protects against inflation. Every retail investor has heard that. The forbidden knowledge is that one specific category of gold sits outside the legal framework that allowed gold itself to be confiscated, and the wealthiest American families have been quietly building that exact position since their grandparents lived through 1933. The 7 assets sit on a balance sheet most investors will never see. Farmland that feeds civilization, art that lives behind steel doors in customs limbo, water that appreciates as the planet dries, trees that grow through every recession on record, royalties pumping cash from formations drilled 50 years ago, whisky aging in bonded warehouses on the Scottish coast, and gold that legally cannot be touched by the same hand that took it in 1933. The pattern underneath all 7 is the only thing that actually matters: real custody, real scarcity, and a legal status outside the banking system. Once you see it, you cannot unsee what the alternative is: a brokerage statement, a bank balance, a digital ledger entry that exists at the discretion of institutions whose first priority during a true crisis will not be you. Most of these assets used to be unreachable for anyone outside the dynastic class. 3 of them now have institutional fund structures, fractional ownership platforms, and direct purchase programs that have brought entry points into the low 5 figures. The barrier today is not capital. It is awareness. And awareness, historically, is the part that arrives last and leaves first. If this changed how you think about where your wealth actually sits, the subscribe button is how more of this finds you.